within your life, you have to create this list of priorities. What are the top 3 things in my life that I care about? And that's also risk analysis. Those top 3 things are the most important to me because I'm not willing to accept the risk of not doing those 3 things. And successful organizations, regardless of the industry that they work in, view strategy this way. What are the 3 things I need to work on? What are the top 5 things I need to work on? And is everything I'm doing driving me towards one of those sort of things? And in security, where we have so much to fix and so many things that can go wrong, we need to be willing to sacrifice the small things to work on the big things.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to episode 46 of the Red Zone podcast, where I invite IT security innovators, leading entrepreneurial minds, and inspiring individuals to share their stories and offer the best tips to you to help you achieve success in IT security, IT business thought leadership, the neuroscience of optimal performance, creativity, and innovation. I'm your host, Bill Murphy, and in today's show, I'm excited to bring to you my interview with Dr. Jack Freund. Jack is the author of a book with Jack Jones on quantifying risk, measuring and managing information risk, a fair approach. I love this book, and I have had Jack Jones on prior to this, and this is the co-author, Jack Freund. And recently, this book was inducted into the Cyber Security Canon in 2016. The Cybersecurity Canon is basically like a hall of fame for IT security books. And the founder of this was actually Rick Howard, who's been a previous guest on this podcast. So Dr. Freund is a leading voice in information risk measurement and management with experiences across many industry segments. His corporate experience includes spearheading strategic shifts in IT risk by leading his staff and executing on multi-million-dollar efforts in coordination with risk and control groups. He's also currently working with a major financial services firm. Also, quite an accomplished academic, being awarded a doctorate in information systems, a master's in telecom and project management, a BS in computer information systems. He holds a CISSP, CISA, CISM, CRISC, CIPP, and PMP designations. I just think it's good to have someone who's currently working with a major financial services firm and also has deep academic credentials. Some of the things we talk about, I've linked up on the show notes. You can find that right on the app on your phone, whether you have your Droid using Stitcher or whether you're using an iPhone. Just hit the button and you can get access to all the links we talk about. His SlideShare presentation, I definitely recommend, called Assessing Quality in Cyber Risk Forecasting. I really enjoy this, and it links to his actual ISSA journal that he just published, an article there calling Using Data Breach Reports to Assess Risk Analysis Quality. And again, you can always hit the show notes at the redzonetech.net/podcast page. So the major takeaways from today, from this episode, are how to elevate your IT security risk communication game using data breach reports to inspire action. We've never really talked about how to do this, but we do dive into this in this show. How to use risk data so that the business becomes more comfortable with uncertainty instead of being like a cat in a hot roof. In addition, new, refreshing perspectives on presenting IT security risk to the business. Also, predicting and forecasting likelihood and frequency of events happening into your risk analysis. This is really important for CIOs and CISOs moving forward, is how to forecast and predict. And then finally, how to use external data breach sources of competitors and non-competitors to build your risk cases. Very interesting. This episode is sponsored by the CIO Scoreboard. If you're interested in transforming your ability to distill complex IT security, governance, and audit information into transparent, simple, and powerfully visual information that can be shown to your vertical reports, like the CFO, CEO, or board, or just to your horizontal business peers, check out visualcio.com. Again, that's visualcio.com to learn more. I appreciate your patience with this lengthy intro. Now on with the show, and I want to welcome you to my discussion with Dr. Jack Freund.
Within your life, you have to create this list of priorities. What are the top 3 things in my life that I care about? And that's also risk analysis. Those top 3 things are the most important to me because I'm not willing to accept the risk of not doing those 3 things. And successful organizations, regardless of the industry that they work in, view strategy this way. What are the 3 things I need to work on? What are the top 5 things I need to work on? And is everything I'm doing driving me towards one of those sort of things? And in security, where we have so much to fix and so many things that can go wrong, we need to be willing to sacrifice the small things to work on the big things. I had a boss at Nationwide years ago who used to, one of his favorite phrases was, I don't want to major in the minors. And I love that phrase because it's exactly the right things. What are the big strategic things that I need to knock out? And I think that FAIR gives organizations large and small tool set to be able to think about and talk about security issues and risk and strategy in that way.
So we have Jack Freund on today, and he and Jack collaborated on the book called FAIR, A Fair Approach, Measuring and Managing Information Risk. And although I know you and I, Jack, aren't going to spend a ton of time on the book, maybe just for our listeners, you can give an overview, and I'll link up the book on the show notes page so that certainly this is a Bible for IT security professionals, CIOs, CISOs. This is a great tool for oneself as a leader, even just to get an overview, and then for the security professionals and risk professionals, definitely a huge benefit for their library. But what does the book, in essence, what does it do for people that you've had your biggest reaction from your readers about?
The book is really the product of the work that Jack Jones did when he created the FAIR methodology. And through my work with him, I've learned a lot about that and had the opportunity to expand it and create some unique applications of it. And I think that the book really gives people a foundation of language in which to talk about and describe risk. It is also a calculation method for how to compute risk. And I think it's a problem-solving book. It's how do I take all these things that I have to worry about, all these things that I have to care about, and how do I boil them down to the things that matter the most to me? And I think the one thing, to answer your question about what's the biggest reaction, is people sort of find it refreshing to think about risk in this way. One of my mentors, I would say, one of the people who I admire the most is Douglas Hubbard, and Jack and I both have borrowed a lot from his work in how to measure risk this way. But he has a quote where he says, what we don't want to do is create, and I'm paraphrasing, we don't want to create our own special secret way of thinking and talking about risk that only applies within IT. What we really want to do is be able to talk about it and apply it in a way that other risk professionals in other disciplines can understand too. And in my time working for larger organizations that have a mature enterprise and operational risk function, I found this to be true, that when we start thinking and talking about risk in terms of expected loss and with ranges and other statistical methods of error bars and that kind of thing, you really begin to see people understand it in a way that wasn't necessarily there. It gives people the ability to bridge the gap between being a highly skilled, very technical security person to gain access to the way that business professionals think about technology and risk associated with it.
Yeah, and I found that myself just reading it I often have to speak in front of boards, and I'm often brought in by the CIO or the CISO to really kind of a show of force, and especially if those CIOs maybe haven't had as much interaction with the board from the IT security side. And it's very, very useful, the book, from the concepts and the metaphors and the way in which it really almost enhances the maturity level of the discussion by the concept of risk and helping to kind of demystify, and I think also to get people out of fear. I think the refreshing piece is that it's almost like stepping outside of the fear brain for a moment and really looking at it more logically and defensively, what the message that's trying to be conveyed by the security organization.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I like that. I like what you said about stepping outside of the fear brain. I think in general, the way we think about risk, regardless of topical area, is how do we not have any? I think many people probably go through life with the unconscious assumption that they have the ability to never die. And we don't, as we all know. So it's really about, in a very sort of morbid kind of way, what are the things that you want to minimize in your life to avoid dying in certain ways? I think when you start thinking about life as inevitable failure to a certain degree, when you start thinking about business as not everything we do is going to be successful, when you think about security as not every control we put in place is going to work 100%, then you start thinking about things in the middle. One of the phrases I use is becoming comfortable with uncertainty. That's a very different way of looking at things. And when you talk about presenting to the board and that kind of thing, I find it wholly unreasonable to expect security professionals to educate the board and for them to become security professionals. They can't. They're experts at managing businesses, and they spent 20, 30, 40 years becoming that. We spend that same amount of time being good at what we do. And I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're smart enough, and we claim that we often are, and I see this all the time, this sort of, those dumb X, Y, and Z, they decided not to do this, and therefore that's a bad security decision. I don't know how they can do that. Well, if we're that smart, then why can't we bridge the gap and learn to think about the business and risk and security the way that they do, in terms of, I know that something bad will happen, I can set money aside in a reserve fund in case that it does, but is the cost of that bad thing happening so great, so high, that it's unreasonable? And if we can't answer that question, then we can't begin to have a reasonable conversation with them. That's what I hope the book helps people to do, is to sort of, while paying homage, of course, to the deep technical knowledge that's necessary to be a security risk professional, but also to understand and sort of extend your view into what's the ultimate goal here. And offering a product or service for money, even if you're a nonprofit organization, if you're offering that product and service in general, is itself a risky venture. So the business is inherently enveloped in risk all day long, and this is just another vector from which bad things can happen. Sort of aligning the way that you think about risk to the way that your greater organizational group forces think about risk is essential to having meaningful conversations with them.
Yeah, and I think which is really interesting is the book is deeply technical, but I found these amazing metaphors for risk that it's funny, you no longer can embed these conversations in the risk department or with the auditor. It's bubbling up into the board, and the context of the languaging has to shift because the board's not really able to hear the message. And I love your statement, becoming comfortable with uncertainty. And it's uncertainty from really a couple levels. And it reminds me of author Pema Chodron, who writes about being comfortable with discomfort of the risk, but being able to have a language where you can have a really adult-oriented conversations without moving into, again, this kind of irrational thinking about purchasing potentially more shiny toys to solve risk, instead of really looking at it from a more logical point of view. In your blog post recently, I'm doing a lot of reading on your blog and your work through ISACA and ISSA. I'm going to put links to your blog and an ISACA article, and also the most recent one you did, which you have a great SlideShare presentation. You really talk about risk work is never complete. It's the continuous improvement should be the goal, and almost embracing being incomplete. But how does someone take that statement of continuous improvement and convey that to business so they know that risk is not something that is static, but it's actually moving and can be a moving target? Like, how do you actually convey that to the business?
I think it's a very mature place to get to be able to have that conversation, and it takes effort. And I think in any organization that's looking to improve quality in the work that they do, they kind of have to approach it the same way. So when I started writing about risk assessment quality, I was sort of thinking about, how do I know if I'm doing this right? And in some of the mathematical work that deals with this kind of thing, and I'm not an expert in math, but I have people that are, and this is what they tell me, is you have to sort of measure what the real results are against what the expected results are. And the best way I found to sort of find that was to use data that was available to you. And I think a lot of organizations don't often have great data inside of them. But if they do, if they have incident data, then that's a good source for that. But if you don't, there's a lot of great industry reports out there that you can use to help measure that. And so that's what I was trying to do, is how to sort of take the results of this. When I say that this system, this application, this server, this database is high risk, how right am I at that? If something were to happen a year from now, would I still be right that it was high risk? And I think that is one of those internal measures that you begin to build that allows you to say, I'm doing this in a correct fashion. So the impetus for this started, again, from Douglas Hubbard's book, How to Measure Anything, when he talked about what he called forecast accuracy. There's some really great equations that can help you with those kind of things, but we don't have enough data, enough ability in the things that we're doing right now with risk data to be able to get that precise with it. But there's meteorological forecasting, for example, uses Brier scoring, and it's, if you say that it's going to rain, that it actually rains, very sort of binary yes or no kind of things. So that was sort of the approach that I took with this. And I said, so can we build these formulas that say, when I said that we expect cyber criminals to attack us once every 2 years to once every 3 years, how right was I? And we can sort of take that view, that window of our event forecasting and look backwards and say, okay, so over the same time period, how many internal incidents do we have that related to that particular attack vector? And then compare them again to external data. How often did this report say that for people that looked like me within the financial services industry, for instance, how often were they attacking us? And produce variance charts to say, well, hey, I think we're underestimating our risk this way. I think we're overestimating our risk this way. And I think it's really kind of fascinating, and it provides sort of that justification for how you take it to the business and say, look, from the best data we had available at the time, we were pretty confident that this was high risk. But now we've seen this uptick in attacks, this uptick in losses. And as a result of that, we need to revise your entire risk portfolio. Whereas before you may have only had one application that was high risk. Now it turns out that the attack frequency has gone up and class action lawsuits have risen as well. And as a result of that, these things are now all going to be high risk. And that's, again, a very mature conversation, but that's deeply indexed to what's going on in the world around us. And I think one of the go-to conversations that you end up having with executives around security is, what's everybody else doing?
Yeah, that happens a lot.
It does. And while it sometimes frustrates me, this sometimes gives you that view into, well, here's what we think is actually happening elsewhere. I say it frustrates me because it's difficult. You don't really want to have a chatty security organization that talks about all this, all of its happenings and all its control failures and that kind of thing. And there are mature industry forums that allow you to have those conversations off the books. But you're never going to know the precise configuration of controls at your competitor, or you're never going to know the exact frequency of attack that they're seeing if they're measuring it at all. So you have to have something to kind of work with, and this I think is a really good proxy for that. It gives you a sort of base measure of how good we think we are at estimating what losses are going to look like, and how good we are at estimating what frequency of attack looks like. Underlying all of that is the need to have standardized ways of measuring and managing risk, and I think that's really where a foundation like FAIR helps with that, because when you're calling certain types of attacks cyber criminals and certain types of attack nation states, it has to be uniform and consistent. And when you're measuring frequency, it has to have meaningful application within your organization. So this is really the things that my staff and I wrote about in the ISSA article and that the slideshow presentation talks about. Those are really sort of add-ons for, once you have started building FAIR into your organization and doing risk assessments, here's how you take it to the next level. Here's how you begin answering that biggest question that we often get when we start to implement FAIR, which is, where am I going to get this data from? And this is one of the ways that you can do that. You can sort of tune the rating tables that you're using. You can gather data internally and externally and compare that and index it and really have your finger on the heartbeat of what's going on within the organization and in your competitors as well.
So if you were a CIO, and a lot of our listeners are going to be CIOs who are going to be also wearing that hat as the CISO as well as there's going to be not that audience, there's going to be just pure CISOs that are listening. And I always struck by the conversation, what others are doing, because if you walk in with a top 10 list, which seems to me to be not a very useful list to walk into a decision maker and say, I would like to purchase these products, these services, the staffing changes, and these are the top 10 areas. If someone wanted to, from a very simple point of view, how would they go about, how would you walk them through evaluating the probability and the potential frequency of events happening that you were hoping that this top 10 list is going to be needed for? So how could you reverse and quickly coach someone through a process to more down the model that you're explaining with your approach?
I think that desire to say what's everybody else doing is a proxy for, I think this other organization is managing themselves really well and I want to be like them. And I think that is usually born out of the fact that people tend to discount their own data in their own organization. There's that universal truth that we've all experienced where you're much more knowledgeable about security when you work outside of an organization. But as soon as they hire you, they need to get outside people to help consult with you about that. And I always find that funny. I experienced a similar thing when I was consulting for state government years ago. Is the state really thought the private industry had security down cold. And when you sort of got to pollinate between both of those kind of organizations, you're like, yeah, maybe not so much. So, if you get to this point where you find that there's a particular technology aligned to your standards and policies that you think would really help drive change in the organization and improve the risk profile, you have to sort of talk about what the reduction in risk is going to be. And oftentimes we're in this quixotic search for ROI in the security industry. I've never been a fan of that term because, again, if you think about the way that true investors think about ROI, your investment in Invincia, as an example, they're not going to pay you out because you avoid certain types of security incidents. There's no cash payout at the end of that. At best, you can do cost avoidance, which I think is almost the same thing, but at least philosophically different enough to really allow you to think through the problem the right way. So if you can say that, we think we're experiencing incidents at this frequency, and it very helps you break that down. If you don't know loss frequency, you can begin deriving it from saying, well, here's often I think that we're attacked. Here's what our control strength looks like, how vulnerable we are to these types of attacks. And if out of 10 attacks you think that 9 of those 10 are going to get through, then you're 90% vulnerable to that, and you reduce your threat event frequency from that. So when that happens, you could say, well, okay, so if we put this technology in place, I think those 9 attacks that are getting through out of 10, that might reduce to 2 or 3. And then you can sort of see how that cascades down through the rest of the equation. If we're experiencing less attacks, that's less time and money we're going to spend responding to it. That's a lower frequency of lawsuits, a lower frequency of fines and judgments, lower frequency of payouts to customers, depending on what kind of business model you have. There's less bad things happening on the other side of that. Less cash that really will be out the door. And these are all future dollars, right? So we haven't actually spent any of this money yet that we may or may not experience loss for. So what you're saying is, I think that if we do this, we're going to have 10 less incidents over a 10-year period. And as a result of that, there's a certain dollar amount that we can forecast as being associated with that. So that's sort of my stock go-to for justifying investments that way. And it actually, that same kind of approach can cascade up to larger strategic initiatives as well. So it's not just I need to buy a box that does X. It's I need to invest in a full end-to-end user access entitlement review system, and I need staff to do that, and I need processes put in place. And you can begin to sort of justify your strategy for all of your cybersecurity activities the same kind of way. And incidentally, this isn't just specific to cybersecurity. You can do this for a lot of things. I need to invest in a new web platform because I think that customers are going to use it more. As a result, we'll experience an increased amount of transactions, which has revenue associated with X.
I think this is really interesting. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Jack, but I'm getting excited about it because you never see the VP of sales come in and say, I will deliver $40 million in sales to you this year, to the CEO. He's saying, I'm forecasting 40 million of sales, and then list out the channels, the analysis done to support that figure. And I'm always struck particularly by one of your slides in a presentation, which was the difference between prediction and forecasting. Maybe you can just explain that really quickly, because that's sort of what you just walked me through, which I found interesting. But maybe you can just make that hyper aware for everybody of what you meant there.
Oh yeah. This is one of my favorite topics. I think there's a point when I was doing fair training with Jack where he makes it very plain that we shouldn't call this prediction, and I sort of had this cognitive dissonance about it, because if I wanted to do that forecast accuracy, if I wanted to go back and look at how good I did at putting these rates around frequencies, I thought, well, if I'm comparing what I thought actually happened to what I said was going to happen, aren't I really predicting something? And then I sort of came to the conclusion that I don't think it's about logic. I think it's just about impression. And I think prediction has a very negative connotation. It really emotes thoughts of fortune telling and that kind of thing. I'm predicting that we're going to have incidents that look like this. And I think forecast in business language, it gives you a little bit more wiggle room. I think people allow you to be wrong when you have forecasts within certain tolerances. And I think that's really what we're talking about. And on the slide there, I included a picture of Hurricane Rita. And I was saying, even some of the best mathematical forecasts in general can't predict where exactly a hurricane is going to land, in a couple-hour time frame, and that's just because of the very difficult nature of how those things work together. All the different systems and the weather patterns and how they interact, and land formations and air temperature and moisture. Cybersecurity, while fundamentally different, still has the same kind of complexities to it. How often people attack, whether we're in the news or not, the state of our controls at that particular time. There's so many things for which there's variability. We can't predict anything. But I can forecast it. And again, I don't think it's a logical difference necessarily. I think it's really more about being open to, like I started with and saying, it's being open to being comfortable with uncertainty. I think forecast allows people to wrap their head around being comfortable with that versus prediction sort of is almost like a challenge,
Yeah, it's so much more positive, and I think it's a much more comfortable business speak for people. And you can be a serious risk professional, an IT security professional, and change your language to a point where, and this is where I love the practicality of being able to communicate with decision makers with this language, because I think what you're emoting is deep logic and reasoning and analysis, but you're taking the conversation to a point where human beings can understand it, who may have a wide and varied business background, and you're bringing it into a language that even they understand, that even sales understands, and I think that's just so important in the security arena, because we have to make the underlying assumption that deep thought is going into the analytics, but when we're coming out, how are we presenting this information? Is what you're saying is really important.
Oh, exactly, and I think there's a big difference between the type of skill sets required to successfully compute risk and the type of skill sets required to communicate risk. And this is one of those key things is knowing the difference between when to use certain words and when not to use certain words. And the thing about forecasting is it's already a term that's widely used within business. We make budget forecasts, we make expense forecasts, we make sales forecasts. People know what that means, and there's not a high expectation of accuracy associated with that. And I think that's one of the things that this allows us to do. And regardless of whether we forecast or predict risk, a decision is going to be made one way or the other. If you're not at the table to have that conversation, to take all that good analytical, technical work that you've done and said, hey, based upon what I know and based upon SME expertise, I think we need to do this. If you're not even at that table and you can't have that conversation in a way the business understands, nothing's going to get done. Even if you have to bring to them something that lacks the precision that you may hope for, that is, a decision can still be made, and we can still move forward, and we can still, appropriately protect the business, or at the very least make the business aware of the choices that they're making so that they can make an intelligent decision.
So a couple clarifying points that I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about is that I find it fascinating. I'd like for our listeners to be able to literally walk out of their car and be able to take action on something they're listening to. And one of the pieces I think that's really interesting that I think could really help immediately is how you integrate external data into your analysis. So you're coming up with a reason how to justify the spending within the organization, IT security spending, and you've done a risk analysis. But what a piece that I'd like you to spend some time on is talk about how you integrate external sources of data so that it doesn't become too complex, but makes a cogent point either regarding competitors or regarding the industry that you may be in. So, for example, if you're a pharmaceutical company, what would be the steps that you would walk someone through to evaluate these external sources to support a decision they want to make?
Yeah. So I think you have to find good sources of data to pull from, and I think there's a lot of really good ones out there. I mentioned the Verizon report. One of our favorites is the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. DataLossDB used to be a good one too. They have I think they have a for-profit model now, but they're also a really good source of data. And it's really just a listing of bad things that are happening at other companies, and it has a data associated with it, so you can inherently get frequency from that. But you have to sort of spend a lot of time massaging that data, and that's what takes a little bit of effort, is taking those reports and looking at how they classify business types. So pharmaceutical might work well for you, but if you are in the durable goods business and not necessarily in the pill business, you have a different model, and you might decide that that's what you think you look like or what you don't think you look like. I found that most companies sort of have this running list of who they think their competitors are. Sometimes it's an aspirational list. So if you're a mom and pop grocery store, sure, Walmart is a competitor, but not exactly on the same level as you. So that you may be losing business with them, but maybe not so much. So from a breach perspective, you have to think about it in terms of who are the attackers targeting. If you wanted to target the top 5 banks, that's a different kind of target than everybody who happens to be in the financial industry. They're going to get credit unions and much smaller organizations that might not have the same panache. So you have to sort of think about that as you go through the data sets, find those organizations that are like you that business can sort of relate to. That looks like me, therefore I understand the risk better is kind of the thinking with this.
Okay.
So when you do that, you have this innate list of here's the frequency. So you have, Roche Diagnostics. I'm trying to think of pharmaceutical companies off the top of my head here. You have this list of companies that may have incidents associated with them regarding data loss and theft, for instance. If you sort of time box this into a year, you can say, okay, so across all of our competitors, I found 5 examples of things that have happened. So any one of those 5 competitors is only having 1 event per year. But we have a larger list of competitors that we care about. So there's 10. So maybe that number looks closer to 0.5. 1/2 a year for them collectively. And you have to sort of compare that to the rates that you're using. And if you're not using those rates, if you don't have those rates established currently, then you can use those sort of inform that better. Like, well, if we look anything like them, this is what we think, this is what we can expect our losses to be the same way. And the same thing works on dollar losses as well, although you tend to find much less data associated with that. And when you do, it tends to only be of certain kinds. In FAIR, we talk about 6 different types of loss. The ones that tend to get published the most are fines and judgments. The other ones, you have to sort of spend some time inside your organization coming up with rates for that kind of thing. Sometimes you get legal fees and response costs as well. But in any case, once you have all those things established, you can begin to sort of build these sets of rating tables that I like to call them, just like you would rate teenagers that are driving cars differently than you would, pensioners in Florida. You have different profiles of what frequency of attack looks like within your organization. So that data becomes very strongly linked and very strongly indicative of what you think that loss, both frequency of loss and magnitude of loss looks like for your organization.
Do you ever weight, for example, intellectual property loss? Is that something that is harder to calculate, or what are your thoughts on IP loss that may not be necessarily something PCI is going to pick up on from a PCI audit,
right,
but
right.
How would you approach that?
There are things that I tend to avoid hard or difficult to measure as a phrase. I think there's measurements that have much more variability in them. And things like reputation loss has that kind of thing. In some of the courses I teach, I'll sometimes, post this theoretical conversation around, what's somebody's life worth? And usually when people, their jaws close and their eyes stop bugging out of their head, that I would ask such an impertinent question, we tend to have a pretty rational discussion around it. I was consulting for one financial company years ago, and I sort of we were teaching them FAIR, and I asked the same question, and everyone was mortified that I asked that question. I said, don't you sell life insurance? Aren't people actually putting a price on their own life? And there's different ways that we do that, and certainly that price is never going to account for the emotional attachment you have with loved ones and things like that. But there is a way to do it, and there's variability in that, certainly. Court proceedings do the same thing all the time. You have these, damages that happen. And organizations like the EPA have rates associated with loss of life. So when I think that we can solve that problem, I could put a price on Bill's head as an example. I think we can solve other problems too, and we can measure things like, if this key patent that we rely upon, if the underlying research associated with that were to be disclosed, how would that affect our organization? I think to answer that question, you got to get the right people in the room, and most of the time, the right people are not security professionals. You got to talk to the people who are trying to market that and trying to get it out there and trying to monetize it. But if you could do that, then you start answering simple questions like, okay, if we couldn't rely upon this IP anymore, if our research was disclosed before we were able to file, for instance, how would that affect our business? And that typically boils down to a couple, not simple, but straightforward questions, and that's, how many less customers are we going to have? How many customers we currently have are we not going to be able to retain? And when and if they choose not to do business with us, how much money do you think we're going to lose? I would expect wide ranges with this. You should estimate it using a min-max most likely kind of thing. So what's the most we can lose? What's the least we can lose? What's the most likely? But when you can start having that conversation, you sort of back off the cliff a little bit and begin to rationalize, okay, here's why this is important. And I think that's one of those key things. And I offer the whole discussion around putting cost on loss of life because that's a hard problem. How do you reconcile that
Sure.
emotional impact of a loss of a loved one? And if we can do that around that, I'm sure we can do it around business process patents. I'm sure we could do it around copyrights, and I guarantee you, Disney has a pretty good view of what that's going to cost them if they ever lose a copyright on Mickey Mouse, as an example.
On your latest journal that you published in Protecting Data Against Cyber Attacks in Big Data Environments, I was just taking a look at reading that through, and it was you talked about data coding and cleanup. And I know I'm kind of picking on one area, and I was just curious what your perspective is on this. Like, where does this fall from a risk point of view in your mind, as far as, is this get into more assessing an asset itself or just general data coding and cleanup within the organization?
Well, I think I'm talking about it in particular regarding using external sources of data. These are oftentimes volunteer efforts, and sometimes the data is just wrong or not applicable. But I think, broadly speaking, when you're building these sort of analysis tools and you're relying upon, say, your company's CMDB system, this repository of all the IT resources that we care about, I think there's a different view of, I can only assess what has been given to me. That old line about, going to war with the army you have. So if the data is wrong, and it's probably wrong to a certain degree or another, I think you could really only be held accountable for the things you have in front of you. And if the response back from the organization, for instance, is, well, you said this server is high risk because it's externally facing, and it's not. Okay, well, I got the data from the CMDB, so we'll go ahead and fix that, and we can update that risk profile to reflect that. At a more meta level, you would have to estimate, well, how many systems do we think have data elements associated with them that I think would cause us to underrate the risk and then overrate the risk? And to what degree is that going to affect losses that we might experience with that? So if we underrate the risk, are we not going to prescribe controls for that system that has a certain amount of loss associated with them? So we'll be exposed to additional loss because of our data coding problems. I think there's ways to do that. It gets, that in particular scenario is probably a little more high level, but it allows us to sort of categorize what we think risk looks like for a poorly maintained CMDB, for instance. Is that
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's just important, I think, for the people to know that when they're pulling the data sets in, and I'm going to link up to your I find your presentation really useful to understand sort of the method of how to do this, but being able to pull in from the sources of data that is not always clean, but that they go through this process and make it better.
Yeah, that's one of those things that anytime you start working with large data sets, especially data sets that you don't have direct control over, there's always going to be some coding problems with them. One thing I learned from social science study is they have a technique for coding things. So if you have to categorize something, you could just have one person do it, but in order to increase the accuracy of it, you have multiple people do it. So if you have, more than one person on your team go through the same list and say, I think this looks like a insider attack, this looks like an external attack, because especially in those external data sets, you get a lot of, sometimes they're very terse, sometimes the descriptions are very long and they contradict what the categorization says. So if you have a couple people go through that and say, that sounds like an insider attack to me, that sounds like an error to me, that sounds like, these kind of things, and you compare that across multiple people, you increase the quality of that data before you begin to do any sort of work with it.
It was an interesting chart to choose. I'm a real big proponent of visual charts, and you make the differentiation between privileged insider breaches and non-privileged insider breaches. And I find it really interesting how you pulled the information from external sources to be able to say, okay, the privileged insiders accounted for X percentage of breaches, and then you compare it to non-competitors. Is the purpose of that to really, like, who would be asking that type of a question? Do you find, does that come back to our original statement, which was, what are our competitors doing, or what are other people doing about this, or who's currently experiencing this problem as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of layers to this, and the first is the distinction between privilege and non-privilege really comes down to one of the factors within FAIR that we use to to analyze the risk, and that's where you apply your preventative controls. So within any organization, you're going to have a certain group of people, Unix admins or DBAs, that really have the keys to the kingdom. They can do anything they want. And the only thing that's stopping them from doing that is that they don't choose to do it. Every time they attempt to do something bad, they're going to succeed because we've already invested in them the rights and privileges to make that happen. That's the big distinction we make between privileged and non-privileged insiders. Is, privileged are the people that you really worry about, not because they do anything with any sort of frequency. I hope if you have a very high rate of privileged insider malicious activity, you probably need to look at your hiring practices. But in most organizations I've consulted with on this, that tends to be a fairly low frequency of attack, just sort of ballpark. Most companies put that in, 1 in 10, 1 in 15, 1 in 20 kind of year event. So when that happens, it matters a lot because you can lose a whole lot from that. But the rest of your organization that doesn't have direct access to anything really damaging, we sort of lump into that other category of non-privileged insider. They have to overcome some kind of control to be able to make their attempt successful. And in FAIR, we call that the difference between a threat event and a loss event. And loss events are basically incidents at that point. So what do they have to overcome? Do they have to bribe somebody? Do they have to be granted access erroneously? Do they have to hack into something, guess somebody's password? All those kind of things serve as friction to keep them from doing bad things. So those charts you mentioned are variance charts that I think are great visualizations to sort of accompany that message to the business that says, hey, we're constantly keeping our finger on the pulse of the security industry, and based upon this latest report, here's what we're seeing. We're seeing this rise and this fall in events of this type, and as a result of that, you can go on to have that conversation around the 10 medium applications in your portfolio are now all high risk, as an example, and here's sort of the reason how we came to that. I think too much we sort of consider risk assessment a one and done kind of thing, where that overall risk rating is what it is every year over year, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's a measure of quality. Is how you're adjusting that in tandem with the changes you see in the organization. We spend too much time focused on controls in particular, and this is really sort of a different look at this. Is how often are people doing things that we need to care about? And that distinction between competitor and non-competitor is exactly to answer that question of what's everybody else experiencing. It's one of those things I think that business looks for in your presentations and in manner of speaking to see if you get it. If you're really thinking about competitive advantage and competitive concerns, I think they really believe that you understand the business that you're in with them, and they take your recommendations more seriously.
Yeah, I guess it does convey a bit of depth of review when looking, but I think it's a different depth. When you look at competitor and you look at external sources, you're deepening. Like you said, you're not just trying to deepen the analysis of controls, but you're actually looking at the landscape to look at the likelihood and frequency of these events happening, which I guess in many respects, it's like if I had 5 buildings to insure and I had different premiums for an insurance policy to look at, I could insure for different levels of risk. I would want to know what the differences are from the premium payments I'm making. One might be just insuring for crater in the ground events. One might be insuring for water damage. One might have different variabilities. But it makes sense. It totally makes sense for a business decision maker to look, okay, I'm spending this amount of money, but what is the risk I'm mitigating with this?
Oh, absolutely. And as the insured, you would want to know if there's anything you could do to lower your premiums, right?
Correct.
If I, behave this sort of way, if I included this additional control, would you lower my rates? And that, again, that's a metaphor that businesses understand. And if you start characterizing and casting security concerns in the same fashion, they get it, and they can have conversations with you about it.
So when we started off the conversation, just as prior to we started recording, we were talking about the most important things to work on because we didn't have an unlimited budget. There's not a limited amount of time, and people generally can get very hyper very fast about security and security spending. And you had an interesting philosophy that in a question you asked that was about focusing on the top 3 things. And what was the question you feel that a security professional needs to ask in a time when we don't have a limitless resources?
Security professionals need to ask, well, what are the most important things I need to work on? Because you're never going to work for an organization that has an unlimited budget to do all the things that they care about. They don't have an unlimited budget to do all of the marketing activities they want, all the new product launches that they want, all the new acquisitions that they want to do. And you have to sort of take the same approach to managing security. You have to sort of look at what are the things that we can do to make the biggest impact? If I only had X number of dollars to spend, would I spend it on mitigating insider attacks or external attacks? What does the data tell me? And you have to be dispassionate about that and be willing to sort of overlook security folklore. Insiders are our greatest risk kind of thinking. And look at, what does the data tell you? Do you work in a business where that is actually true, or is it something else? And casting those priorities, I think, are really important. And anytime you have to sort of create a punch list of the top 3 things that we care about, whether it's security concerns or whether it's a list of priorities and what you want to accomplish, priority equals risk every single time. It's those are the top 3 things we care about because we're not willing to accept the risk of not doing those 3 things. And so you have to think about it the same way. How often am I going to experience loss associated with that? And when I do, how bad is it going to be? And you have to sort of make sure that all the strategic things you're doing and all the tactical things you're doing align to those top 3 things. We're managing our top risks because we have these programs in place and we have these daily processes that run to make sure that we're managing risk in this fashion. And aligning all that allows you to say very confidently to management in your organization that we get it and we see how these top 3 things affect our overall risk profile, and we've indexed them to impact business objectives. And that's a very powerful way to run your security organization.
Well, I really appreciate you for making that distinction, Jack. This is a great way to kind of bring this to closure because it seems obvious, but it's not. And I think sometimes we can get so harried with the amount and volumes in our life that we're tackling professionally that it's very difficult to sometimes distill to the core 3, of which then you can use your model with the FAIR model and your approach of using outside sources to support data for frequency and how bad the loss will be. We can lose that in the volumes. We can lose the fact that we need to be simple and focused and on the top 3. So that is a great summary. So I appreciate you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Jack, thanks very much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. I'm going to link up both your presentations, your blog, LinkedIn profile, and your previous work for your writing. Is there anything, as we wrap up, that you want to share with our audience before signing off?
I just point out that this past April 5th, Jack and I actually were inducted into the Cybersecurity Canon. So the book that we wrote was selected by Rick Howard, the CSO at Palo Alto Networks, is one of the books that cybersecurity professionals must read. So it was a great honor, and they put on a great show there for everybody, and they treat us very well. But it was nice to interact with some of the other authors that won as well. But I think it's also sort of external validation that what we're talking about and what we're writing about matters a lot, and that people get it, and that they understand that this is really solving a problem that we have as an industry. So
it really is.
Point that out.
Yeah, it really is, and I really deeply appreciate the work you're doing, Jack. I know Rick Howard quite well. He's been on the podcast last year, and he's a power-packed individual. He's a lot of fun to talk with.
He's a great guy.
But that's a big win for you guys in the book, and I highly encourage everybody to go out and get a copy of it. So, well, thank you very much, Jack, and hopefully we can get you on for round 2 here sometime the next 12 to 24 months.
I'd be happy to come back. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Bye-bye. Well, I appreciate you for listening to my conversation with Dr. Jack Freund. I'm super excited about the show notes page for this episode in particular because it will lead you to some very important learning information. You can find the show notes at redzonetech.net/podcast, or simply just go onto your phone and click the show image, and it'll link out to the links that you can check out from our conversation together. Make sure you also check out our sponsor, CIO Scoreboard. Learn how to integrate your auditing and compliance objectives with real and practical IT security initiatives by using powerful visualization techniques and strategies that high-level business decision makers will understand. Go to visualcio.com to learn more. Again, that's visualcio.com. Until next time, I'm signing off. Thank you and have a great day. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.